In the early 20th century, a single chemical discovery smoothed out the vibrations of car engines, but it saturated the Earth's atmosphere with a neurotoxin that would eventually lower the global IQ. By the 1920s, the mass production of the automobile was rapidly filling city streets, but engineers faced a mechanical bottleneck. In high-compression engines, the fuel-air mixture often exploded prematurely. This engine knock created violent shockwaves that could shatter pistons and damage exhaust valves. General Motors tasked an ambitious engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr. with finding an additive to stop the detonation. After testing thousands of substances, Midgley found that adding a tiny amount of tetraethyl lead smoothed engine performance immediately. Lead was a known ancient poison, but it was also cheap to produce and highly effective. To solve a noise problem for the Cadillac, the industry began preparing to release a neurotoxin into mass consumer production. General Motors and Standard Oil formed the Ethyl Corporation to manufacture and profit from the new additive. The corporation prohibited the use of the word lead in its marketing and public reports. Instead, they branded the toxic mixture as ethyl, a name designed to sound modern and harmless. The reality inside the factories was much different. Tetraethyl lead is absorbed directly through the skin and lungs, passing easily into the central nervous system. Workers began suffering from acute lead poisoning, which triggered violent psychosis. At a refinery in New Jersey, men began hallucinating swarms of flies and brushing imaginary insects off their bodies. They called the building the House of Butterflies. When the press investigated, Thomas Midgley held a conference where he washed his hands in a bowl of the additive to prove it was safe. Behind the scenes, Midgley had recently been forced to take a leave of absence to recover from lead poisoning himself. The industry's PR campaign succeeded. For the next 30 years, the world would breathe in lead particles exhausted from every passing tailpipe. In 1952, geochemist Clair Patterson arrived at the California Institute of Technology to determine the exact age of the Earth. His method involved measuring the decay of uranium into lead within microscopic zircon crystals. But Patterson's data was chaotic. Every time he ran a sample, the lead readings were spiking far beyond what the physics of the rock allowed. He eventually realized the problem wasn't his math or his instruments. Every tool in his lab, the dust on the floor, and the air outside were saturated with industrial lead particles. Before Patterson could establish a date for the planet, he first had to separate his samples from the toxic fog of the industrial world. Patterson built one of the world's first ultra-clean rooms. He acid-washed his glassware and installed advanced air filters, treating his lab like a surgical ward to keep the environmental lead out. In 1956, he finally secured an uncontaminated reading. Patterson calculated the Earth's age at 4.55 billion years, a figure that remains the standard today. But the source of the contamination haunted him. He pivoted his research to trace where all that industrial lead was actually coming from. He traveled to Greenland, drilling deep into ancient ice to sample layers of the atmosphere trapped centuries ago. The ice core showed that for thousands of years, atmospheric lead levels were nearly non-existent. Then, beginning in the 1920s, those levels suddenly increased by more than 100 times. The timeline of this spike was the smoking gun. It perfectly matched the arrival of leaded gasoline in the consumer market. When Patterson published his findings, the oil lobby responded by rescinding his research grants and pressuring Caltech to fire him. For decades, the industry's defense rested on a single theory, that lead in the blood was a natural, harmless part of human biology. They argued that unless a person showed signs of acute industrial poisoning, the lead in the air was irrelevant. In 1966, Patterson took his evidence to Washington, testifying before a Senate subcommittee on air pollution. He used his ice core data to prove that the industry's natural baseline was actually the result of massive recent pollution. He demonstrated that humans in 1966 had far more lead in their bones than any of their ancestors. This testimony provided federal regulators with the evidence needed to challenge the industry's claims in court, initiating a 10-year legal and political struggle to establish the first air quality standards. By the 1970s, the smog over major cities had reached a crisis point, forcing the government to mandate the use of catalytic converters. These devices were designed to scrub 90% of the toxic pollutants from a car's exhaust before they reached the air. But there was a mechanical conflict. The lead particles in gasoline physically coated the precious metals inside the converter, neutralizing the filter almost immediately. This catalyst poisoning meant that to save the air, the government finally had a mechanical reason to remove the lead. In 1975, the EPA mandated that new cars use unleaded fuel. Gas stations nationwide were forced to install new pumps to accommodate the change. After the final ban on leaded gas for on-road vehicles in 1996, lead levels in the blood of the average American plummeted by 80%. Clair Patterson's pursuit of the Earth's ancient history had accidentally uncovered the source of a global poisoning, initiating a cleanup that removed millions of tons of neurotoxins from the atmosphere.